All right. Welcome back to Streaming Media East 2023 here in Boston, Massachusetts. Had to think for a second where we were. I'm here with Daniel Strom from System 73, and
Right.
Daniel, you were on a number of panels yesterday talking about some topics that were of interest to me. One of them specifically was this whole conversation around being able to deliver parts of chunks before the whole chunk is done encoding. And just as a bit of background, I wrote one of the first papers around fragmented MP4 that got Microsoft and Adobe to allow me to co-author something for them, which was huge at that point. But even at that point, I kept saying, we're painting ourselves in a corner, we're going to be stuck with 30-second latency because of the segment sizes.
Okay.
Obviously, as we've moved forward in the industry, we're now saying, how do we lower that latency so that we can actually still deliver it with the HTTP way of delivery, but keep it lower. So describe to me a little bit about what you were talking about yesterday and how you can bring those latencies down, but still keep it stable by not dropping below certain levels that people have tried in the past, which seem to make it unstable.
Perfect. It makes complete sense. And first of all, thank you for having me.
Sure.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak about those details a little bit more longer than what we have in the panel. But it's one of the topics that I wanted to raise during the panel because it's not very well known across the industry, most of the time because when we are building streaming workflows, very seldomly we go to a single provider that does everything.
Right.
So usually this is built piecewise fashion, so integrating different providers, but whenever you want to reach low latency, any step of the delivery chain is really important because any extra delay introduced in the delivery chain is going to throw over the window your goals of low latency. But then, of course, then comes the conversation of, okay, who is the provider that is going to be able to provide me this need? And then I end up going to a single provider that provides end-to-end delivery workflows that usually involves either something proprietary or something that is closer to the state of the art that you are, of course, getting lower bounds in terms of latency, but sometimes you are sacrificing, for example, a bare minimum element of resiliency in your workflow that is not relying on a single provider for your delivery. So most of the time, actually on the very next panel, we were discussing about multi-CDN strategies. And that is an inherent part of, among other things, having robustness of not relying on a single provider in case of a blackout or in case of a lack of performance, right?
And I think the industry has risen to the point where we say we need multiple CDNs, whether it's for resiliency or load balancing. So therefore, no single provider solution.
Exactly. So now, of course, everything goes back to the challenge of how to achieve that goal of low latency using at least ecosystem that is mostly established. So essentially results back to HTTP-based request. That is what are the CDNs usually historically built for, and then of course become more adapted in order to use that for streaming with protocols like HLS and Dash, and of course later on with CMAF as a common factor for all of them, right? So now, how is the challenges that we need to overcome in order to achieve that low latency, but not essentially throwing away other resiliency factors or robustness factors for delivery chain? So that's where I mentioned that the concept of the frontier of the segment is not a necessarily driving factor to establish what is the lower bound of your latency in your delivery chain. And that is an idea that whenever you start looking into it, it actually becomes a driving factor to understand where are the bottlenecks in your delivery chain, even across different providers. So for example, let's say that we are talking about a common scenario in HTTP-based streaming, either HLS or Dash, where you have video segments of 6 seconds, right? Originally, everybody was working with 10, but nowadays standardization is on 6, right?
But you still need at least 3 of those typically, so you've got that delay that has come, or traditionally.
Correct. The standard recommends to have at least 3 segments, so you have at least a level of buffer in the video player in order to be able to establish it. But that is just a recommendation based on the original standardization effort where, hey, I just receive 1 full segment into the video player before I can actually start playing it back, right? So that hence the recommendation of having at least 3, because you have 1 being advertised and actually being delivered as we speak right now, but it's not yet available on the video player.
Right.
But at least the video player knows that it exists, so he can start asking for it.
Right.
Then we have the second one that was already delivered, but it's on the buffer. And then we have the third one that's already being played by the player. So that's the bare minimum if you have essentially a video segment that you cannot piecewise deliver or consume or even playback on the video player.
Right.
But technologies have evolved to overcome that frontier.
Okay.
And whenever you have all the pieces of your delivery chain able to close that frontier, to break that frontier inside the segment, then many things are becoming possible. So whenever you have, let's say again, a video segment of 6 seconds, but you are able to announce it to your audience through the manifest that that video segment is going to be available because you're on a live stream, right? In a live stream, you know that one video segment is going to be available one after the other, right? There's no surprise about
Until
that,
it's not. Yeah.
Until it's not, of course. But at least you can say, hey guys, there is a new segment coming, right? Please start asking for it, even before it has started to be encoded, right? So that's a matter of encoding. There are different providers that are able to do that. We are actually not providers of that kind of technologies, but we are familiar with that, and we have done POCs with that kind of elements, but it proves that it can be done. And whenever you have that, hey, you have the encoder announcing to the origin, and then announcing to the CDN, and then announce it to the players, there is a new segment coming. Please ask for it. The video players know that there is a new segment coming saying, hey, CDN, please send it to me.
Right.
The
As
CDN,
soon as it's available.
before it is available. So
Right.
that's the trick.
No. Right. I'm saying that the player says, send it to me as quickly as you can.
Exactly.
But it's asking before it ever even exists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's asking before it even exists.
Right.
And what happens is that the CDN, if it's configured correctly, they will perceive that announcement at the same time for a lot of people. If you are going to a large event, but even in a small event, you have concurrency of that announcement and concurrency of that request.
Which is where the coalescing comes in.
Exactly. So you have the CDN in place saying, oh, I'm not going to send all of those requests as cache miss upwards.
Right.
I'm going to say cache hit.
Yeah.
And please wait.
Okay.
I'm going to send a request back to the origin. The origin is also configured with request collapsing.
Okay.
And the most important part is that the encoder needs to be able to, the HTTP server that is in front of the encoder should be able to also do request collapsing.
Got it.
And have that segment in delivery with traditional protocols that are able to receive the content in a chunk and transfer encoding mode that essentially is delivering the chunk as it is being encoded by the encoder with an open connection towards the origin or the origin shield. Then all of those connections open to the CDN POPs, and all of those POPs open connections to the players, all of them assuming that it's an HTTP request that is ongoing.
Right.
And the pace of delivery is just driven by the encoding pace.
So, I have a number of questions, but I'm going to limit it to 2. So, when you do the request coalesce, and it's aggregating in all those requests and saying, just a second, I'll deliver it to you from the encoder standpoint, are we getting to like a pseudo multicast model almost? Because it's a whole bunch of unicast requests that get pushed down into one.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's the holy grail of, from my perspective, of saying, oh, for example, the discussion that we had earlier yesterday about multicast is dead, long live multicast, right?
Yeah.
So it was very funny for me because multicast as a concept, at the end, in the first principle approach, is just a way of relaying content on specific parts of the network.
Replicating it to
Exactly. That's the basic idea. Now, traditionally, multicast means mentally, oh, I'm going to do this on the IP layer, right?
Right.
But it shouldn't be that case, right? Actually, what we do in System 73 is replicating that multicast on the application layer.
Okay, that makes more sense. Now I understand where.
And this is not related necessarily with low latency,
but
the same principles that we apply to achieve large scalability into the audience that we want to reach is applying multicast on the application layer, but being compatible with traditional HTTP,
Unicast.
HLS, exactly.
Yeah.
So whenever you are able to pull that off, very interestingly enough, not only large scalability for broadcasting events for
But
live.
your latency drops because there are a lot fewer things going on in the system.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the coalescing essentially takes a lot of the computation out of, I gotta schedule all these requests out as they go. So here's the other question on that. Because I've been in the industry for 25 years now, there were little things that people tried to do where they would tweak segment sizes down below a second, and of course you'd run into a number of issues with that. And then there was the whole TCP windowing issue about getting it too low down there. The other panelist from CDN 77, he and I were talking about where the reason that they stick with traditional HLS and dash segment lengths rather than necessarily using, say, Apple's low latency HLS that Roger Pantos came and talked about a couple streaming media shows back, was that they can't necessarily get those legacy devices out there. They either have to build everything to low latency HLS, which may leave out some of the legacy devices, or you build everything to standard HTTP, standard segment sizes, like you said, and then you have the problem of having that longer latency. With what you're suggesting, and he gave a description of how they do it, but with what you're suggesting, essentially because those requests are coming in and being coalesced, I can send a portion of the segment out?
Correct.
Okay, got it. And then the question I had for him is, when you do that on an intermittent network, especially a mobile device, what happens if you miss those deltas? Because that's one of the things when Roger Pantos talked about low latency HLS, he's essentially saying, we're taking a segment and putting it in here, and then what are the deltas in between them? That's great if you're on a stable network, but if you're on an intermittent network, you may miss a couple of those, and then the question is, do you have to wait till the entire length of the segment to pick back up? So
that's a very good question. And actually, in my humble opinion, it depends a lot on the kind of content and the kind of expectation that the audience would like to have in terms of their experience. For example, if we're talking about traditional broadcasting for a large audience, that will be a suitable use case for using HTTP-based content request. That means that usually those customers will not like to miss a piece of the content because of a stable network.
Right.
In traditional streaming, you may have a rebuffering event,
right.
and of course that means that you are not receiving content
right.
for a short while. And now the decision that content providers need to make is, what do I want the experience to be? Do I accept that maybe if that rebuffering event happened in the middle of a scoring event in a sport venue, I'm willing to not show that goal to my end users, or I prefer to accept that there's going to be a rebuffering event and then continue the playback from that point onwards. And there are measurements to, first of all, of course, minimize that kind of event, but also if it happens, because the reality is that it's going to happen, what you want to do afterwards. In my humble opinion, with HTTP-based streaming, you are able to decide what you want to do.
Right, so you can add your business logic as you choose.
Exactly, you can configure the player to decide, hey, I want to wait until the content comes by, continue the playback, of course, with an increased glass-to-glass delay, but you can speed up slightly and then catch up again, or just accept that the connection is unstable and increase the delay into glass-to-glass. And you don't have to make it for all audience at the same time. You can accept that for only the people that is being impacted
somebody
by
on Telecom Italia versus somebody sitting at home on a
exactly, and you can even choose if you want to enable by default the catch-up for all your audience, or just disable it by default, or just give the option to the end user to choose what their experience would be. And on the other hand, you want to keep the content because you want to have everybody synchronized all the time. You can configure the player to say, okay, if I'm behind more than, say, 1 second, let's skip content.
Just jump me forward.
And jump again.
All right. We could have 30 minutes more of conversation on this, but I'm being given the cue that it's time to wrap up. So Daniel, thank you very much for spending time with us. And we'll be right back with our next guest.